Okay, our focus today is going to be on answering questions from a line plot. If you remember from our prior lessons, we started with a table where we had data. We took this table and we created a line plot. So when we created our line plot, this line plot showed the information on the table. So now we're going to answer some questions about this line plot and this data. So we're going to start here where our first question says, what is the difference between the largest amount of rainfall and the smallest amount of rainfall? So let's come back and look at our line plot. And it asks me for the difference between the largest amount of rainfall and the smallest amount of rainfall. We're not going to use these numbers on the end of our line plot because there was no data captured there. We know that the largest amount of rainfall that we had was 1.5 inches. We know the smallest amount of rainfall that we had was 3/4 of an inch. And we're finding the difference because it asks us the difference between the largest amount and the smallest amount. So I'm automatically looking this and remembering what we've learned already. When we add and subtract fractions, they must have a common denominator. So there's different ways that we can do this. One way is we could draw a model. So if I represent this as 1/2 and 1/2, and I want to take away fourths, I've got to make sure both of my models are partitioned into fourths. And then I can take away 1/4, 2/4, 3/4. I am left with 3/4. Another way I could do this is draw a number line. So if I looked at 1 1/2, if I started at 1 1/2 and I take away 3/4, I'm going to have my number line into fourths, but I can go back 1/4, 2/4, 3/4. And again, I end at 3/4. The last way that you have learned how to do this is by creating a common denominator. And so I know that halves and fourths are related. I can make an equivalent fraction with halves to fourths by multiplying 1/2, the top and the bottom, by 2. And when I do that, I get an equivalent fraction. 1/2 is equivalent to 2/4. So I could subtract 1 2/4 minus 3/4. I need to take away 3/4 and I only have 2/4, so I could rename 1/2 as 4/4. And I know that 4/4 and 2/4 is 6/4, but I also know that 6/4 is equivalent to 1/2 and 2/4 anyway. And then I could subtract my 3/4, so 6/4 minus 3/4 is 3/4. So let's go back to this question. The difference between the largest amount of rainfall and the smallest amount of rainfall is 3/4. And we've looked at that with models and by changing a common denominator. So let's answer the next question. Our next question asks how many total inches, or how many inches in total, did it rain in February, September, and October? So I need to look February, 1 1/8, okay. September, 1 1/8, and October, 9/8. Well, I know that that's equivalent to 1 1/8. So it's asking me how many inches in total did I have? Well, I noticed that February was 1 1/8. I noticed that September was 1 1/8. And I noticed that October was 9/8 or 1 1/8. And it asked me how many inches in total. So the equation that I was trying to solve here is 1 1/8 plus 1 1/8 plus 1 1/8 equals A. We'll just put that as our variable. So I can see 1/2 plus 1/2 plus 1/2 is 3/2. 1/8 plus 1/8 plus 1/8 is 3/8. So I can solve it that way because these already have a common denominator. Another thing that you learn in 4th grade is that we could, and it actually reminds us of what we've learned this year in 5th grade with multiplying fractions, is anytime we add the same amount over and over again, we can multiply. So I could have multiplied by 3 as well. You guys learned in an earlier unit that I would have to convert this into a improper fraction. So 1 whole is 8/8. Let's rewrite that so that looks better. So 1 whole is the same as 8/8 plus the 1/8 I have. So I'm looking at 9/8 times 3. And we always know that the denominator for a whole number is going to be 1. So when I multiply across, I get 27/8. And that is an improper fraction. So 27/8, if I want to convert that into a mixed number, I know that 8/8 is a whole, 8/8 is a whole, 8/8 is a whole. So I've got 1 whole, 2 wholes, 3 wholes, but that's only 8, 16, 24. And so I have 3/8 left over. So this is also 3 3/8 inches. So the same idea here. So if I go back to my question, how many total inches did it rain in February, September, and October? It rained 3 3/8 inches. Let's look at another one. How many months had 1 inch or less of rain? Let's go to our line plot. How many months had 1 inch or less of rain? Since it said 1 inch or less, I'm going to have to count the number of months on the 1 as well. So we had 2 months with 1 inch of rain, and then we had 1, 2, 3 months with less than 1 inch. So in total, we had 5 months that have 1 inch or less of rain. So that one was pretty easy to answer. 5 months had 1 inch or less of rain. Here's our last problem. How many inches of rain did November and June have? So I'm looking at November. November had 7/8 of an inch. June had 1 1/2 inch. So if I come down here, again, looking at my equation, I know that I'm going to have to combine these. Addition means to combine them, and I'm trying to figure out how many inches of rain did November and June have together. So I'm going to have to add 7/8 plus 1 1/2 to get my answer. I'm going to put A again there for my variable. So again, we're adding or subtracting, so we're not going to be able to add and subtract across numerator and denominator. We've got to find a common denominator. So again, we could draw our models. We could have 7/8 plus 1 whole and 1/2. But if I know that they have to have the same number of pieces, I would have to make these halves 8ths. Well, that would be 8/8 because that's a whole. And this will be 4/8. So I've got 7/8 plus 8/8 plus 4/8. I already know that 8ths are 1 whole. But now I've got 7/8 plus 4/8. And that gives me 11/8. I know that that is still an improper fraction. I can turn 11/8 into 1 3/8 and add it back to my whole to get 2 3/8. I could also take an 1/8 from here and move it over here, and I have 1 whole, 2 wholes, and 3/8 right there. That's another way that I could have done it. I could have also made a common denominator, which we looked at a little bit ago, where I turned my halves into 8ths by multiplying the top and the bottom by 4ths. And so I got 4/8. And again, I would have gotten 1 11/8, which we just looked at down there. We would have to break apart 11/8 into 8/8 plus 3/8, which gives me another whole. So I have 1 whole 2 wholes, and 3/8. So going back to here, how many inches of rain did November and June have? I had a total of 2 3/8 inches. You're going to practice now answering your own questions on line plots as well.